Today, let's talk about Warzone settings and a few things that you can optimize to make your Warzone experience a little bit better. I'm going to talk about some general things first that should apply to both console and PC, but later I will be going to PC specific settings. However, since the integration is coming up very soon, some of these settings will be applying to you, so it may be worth sticking around. So let's start off with a little bit of optimization, and this is just how you sort your loadouts. And the best way to do it is to have different categories or sections that are grouped together. My first three loadouts are all ghost loadouts, and they run pretty self-sufficiently. My fourth is also a ghost loadout, but this is the one that I get whenever I get a second loadout. It does mean though that you can't be as aggressive at the beginning until you got your second loadout. Anything past here does not have ghost. Next is my restock snapshot class, and this one is kind of for the end of a game. I used to have a growl here, but I decided to stop being a sweaty and just went with a Holger. You can easily swap the snapshot for a stun grenade because that would help you be more aggressive. Next up with the stars are my overkill loadouts. I've got an aggressive loadout, a balanced loadout, and a defensive loadout. So just because you have these loadouts doesn't mean you have to pick them. They're there for when you need them, and it's good to have as much variety as you can. Then I've got my MP7 J36 class. It's my fun go-to loadout when I don't really care about doing that well. And lastly, there's the shield class. But I do think that it's worth having a shield class. Either because you run into plenty of hackers, or in the late game, you could be in a close quarter situation, and it's nice to have a shield on your back. Now the thing about order. Why did I put the ghost class above the overkill classes? This completely depends on the type of person. I don't usually get my loadout extremely early in the game, so by the time I get mine, people are calling in UAVs. But whenever I'm feeling more aggressive or it's really early in the game, then I always go for an overkill loadout first. But I have time to go down instead of usually going down to the first loadout. And having ghost at the top, especially my EM2 loadout, does mean that whenever I need to buy something really quickly, it's right there. And this is easier for controller players to do, so just have your favorite loadout at the top. So now let's get into the settings. Starting with general settings, we have field of view, and console players, this will apply to you in a few weeks. There is no specifically perfect FOV. I have mine set to 100 because I'm on an ultra wide display. I have extra peripheral vision naturally. I know 115 or 105 are extremely popular, so I would try those out if you haven't already. Just whatever you do, don't stick to 80 because you're at an extreme disadvantage when you're up close. And another setting that you should always change is changing your ADS field of view to affected. And you should skip the introduction movie just to save yourself a few seconds. Subtitles, I would actually enable them because sometimes it does let you know that there's an enemy nearby even when you can't actually hear them. The most important setting that everyone should know is to change your minimap type to square because you'll get a much larger area. And make sure that minimap rotation is enabled. For compass directions, use letters because it's a lot easier to say west instead of 270 degrees. The rest of the settings are completely optional. Audio settings, and especially audio mix, are really tricky settings. You need to set this specifically for your headset or audio setup. But you should probably use one of the boost options or the midnight mode if you want a tactical advantage. Load into a practice match and try to listen for the footsteps. You're going to want master volume at 100% for obvious reasons, but you're going to want to turn music to 0. Sure, the music is nice sometimes, but at the end of the game, that music can be extremely distracting. And even if you don't get distracted, it could still be covering up footstep noises, so turn it off. Mono audio, make sure that it's disabled because you do want to know which direction things are happening in. Voice chat settings are up to you, but I do advocate for people using push to talk because we don't need to hear every single noise that you make. Voice chat effects, make them turned off because it sounds really bad. And if you have war tracks enabled as a passenger, either change it to 50 or lower because you'll actually want to be able to hear what's going on. Now for graphics settings, after that we'll cover controls and their options. So for display mode, I recommend that you use full screen because this does tend to boost your FPS a bit more. And always switch your screen refresh rate to your maximum possible. Render resolution, if you can, keep it at 100%, and as for VSync, this is kind of a hard question. If you use VSync in your NVIDIA control panel or the AMD equivalent, then don't use it here. But if you don't use it there, you should probably turn it on here if you don't like screen tearing. I use a custom frame rate limit because I have G-Sync, and I set this to 3 FPS under my refresh rate to minimize any latency or dropped frames. If you have access to NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency, turn it on because it does help with latency. And if you don't mind that your computer gets a bit hot, then use Enabled plus Boost. You can set streaming quality low because it doesn't really seem to affect anything. I recommend a normal texture resolution, but if you have VRAM to spare and you don't mind taking a pretty big FPS hit, then you can go on high. Texture filter should always be on high, particle quality as well, and bullet impact and sprays should be turned off. But I have mine on because I have to shoot the wall to get recoil patterns for you guys. Tessellation should also be off because it doesn't seem to do anything, and on-demand texture streaming should also be turned off. Shadow map resolution should be turned to high because they actually help FPS. Now, cache spot shadows and sun shadows are a bit tricky. If you have a 1070 or better, I would probably turn these on, but if you have a 1060, keeping them off may actually help you more. Particle lighting doesn't do anything in Warzone, so you can turn it to low, and DirectX ray tracing should always be turned off. Ambient occlusion and screen space reflections are a bit tricky. They are pretty taxing, but they make the game look better. I have these on because I make videos, but if I was playing competitively, I would turn these off. Turn filmic strength to 1, especially if you're using the last filmic anti-aliasing setting. If you have an NVIDIA card, you have access to NVIDIA Filters, which actually gets rid of the blurriness that comes with using this setting. If you don't have an NVIDIA card, then you can probably use the settings before, or FXAA, or no anti-aliasing if it doesn't bother you. But I highly recommend the final option with NVIDIA filtering. Depth of field, world motion blur, and weapon motion blur should all be disabled, as well as film grain. There's no need to have these settings on when they hurt your FPS, and also make it harder for you to actually compete in the game. And lastly, dynamic resolution can be turned off, because it can introduce stuttering. So an example of what the NVIDIA filters look like, here is me toggling it on and off. I only use 3 filters. Sharpening to 15%, brightness with -20% on shadows, and color to 30% vibrance boost. So before we get into keyboard and mouse settings, I recommend that you go to your desktop and actually change one thing. You're probably going to want to turn off mouse acceleration. This lets you build muscle memory, and you can access this setting by using your mouse's software or by going to advanced mouse settings in Windows. So I can't really say a lot about your sensitivities, but I recommend that you probably turn them down if you have a high DPI like I do. Now, a pretty important thing to do is to switch your aim down sight mouse sensitivity to relative. But once you do this, make sure your monitor distance coefficient is actually set right. To get your monitor's distance coefficient, all you gotta do is divide the resolution's width by its height. So I got 2.39 by dividing 3440 by 1440. And then, in the game, just make sure your mouse acceleration is turned off and mouse filtering is turned off. Controls are very subjective, and I know that my setup is not like anyone else's. But some basic things that I can tell you is that you probably want crouch and prone as a toggle, not as a hold. Automatic airborne mantle probably should be disabled so you don't accidentally mantle onto something you're just trying to peek over. And hold to use should definitely be disabled if you're using a keyboard. And I won't even attempt to tell you guys what keybinds to use, but make sure that you have a specific slide button. I really enjoy using the weapon mount activation by double tapping ADS, since it's very unlikely to accidentally do this, and it's very easy to do instead of having a different keybind. I recommend you also have weapon mount movement exit enabled, but switch its delay to something like 49, something that feels very natural. For armor plates, I would keep it on apply 1. And lastly, for maps and map cursor behavior, keep them on toggle and enabled so you can keep moving while you're using your map. I know this was a lot of settings, but I hope it does help some of you figure out what settings to use. Because I know how confusing it can be to get a new game, system, or getting on PC for the first time and being overwhelmed by the insane amount of settings. Were you surprised that any of these settings existed, or are you someone who went through and changed every single setting already? And if there's any weapon, build, or part of the game you want to break down, let me know and you may see it on the next Community Wednesday. But that's the video. If you enjoyed it or it's helped you in any way, let me know by leaving a like. If you got any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section down below. And if you want to make sure that you never miss another video, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.